Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. My name is Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on February 15th with Larry Jensen. He will be giving a presentation entitled Using German Maps and Atlases. Note that this lecture will be pre-recorded with no Q&A section. Larry Jensen's contact information will be provided at the end of the webinar. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Maureen Brady, who will be giving a presentation on analyzing your research. Before we begin, here's a little bit about Maureen. Maureen Brady, a former school librarian and computer educator, has 40 years' experience with family history research. She has traced her Scottish roots back to the end of the 17th century and beyond, and has also pursued Chicago and the Midwest, the Trans-Allegheny U.S., Quebec, Irish, and Swedish research. Maureen has made numerous presentations to genealogical societies, libraries, conferences, and workshops throughout the U.S., as well as presenting for the Brigham Young University Library Family History webinar series. She is a member of the Genealogical Speakers Guild, as well as a life member of the Aberdeen and Northeast Scotland Family History Society and the Ohio, Chicago, and McHenry County, Illinois Genealogical Societies. She is also active in the Kentucky, Middle Tennessee, and Lake County, Illinois Genealogical Societies, the British Interest Group of Wisconsin and Illinois, and the Chicago Scots Genealogical Group. And we'll now turn the time over to Maureen if she is ready.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for that introduction. This presentation came about because as I work with patrons at the FamilySearch Center, and I've been working on one for 40 years now, often they have a stumbling block because they don't take the time to really look at what they already have. They miss clues that are already in the documents that they have been able to find. So that was what was the catalyst for me developing this particular program. And we're going to look at records, but we're also going to look at using analysis of search terms on websites. So let's first look at vital records. I presume Olivia is putting the handout in the chat. It's mainly just an outline of what I'm giving you today, but there are some information that you don't need to have time to write it down. It'll be in the handout. So let's first talk about vital records. That is birth, marriage, and death records that are recorded by a government. It could be a city, a county, a state, a country, but it is not a church record. These are official government records. It would also include tax records and wills and probates and school lists and all sorts of things if it's created by a government entity of some sort. And much of this is now available online, at least as far as an index at both FamilySearch and Ancestry and several other sites, depending on the country. And indexes, of course, are helpful because they help us find the record we're looking for, but it does not tell the whole story. When you can access the original record, that is what you should always do. And I'm going to give you an example, a couple of examples of why. So this is the index from FamilySearch on Illinois Cook County deaths, 1871 to 1998. And this is my great-grandfather's index to his death certificate. You can see his name and age and so forth, and it looks pretty complete. It gives you an address, it gives you a burial date, a death date, a birthplace and date, and so on. But when you take a look at the original record for that death, you can see that there's a lot more information on this record, and in fact, some of it is much more complete than what shows up in the index. An index is created by the website that is hosting it, and they decide what goes into the index and which fields they want people to look at. So let's take a look at this and compare the index to the original record. So on the index, we have an address up here. and we see a death place as the state of Illinois only, nothing else going on there. But if I look at the certificate, not only do I have a full place of death at 2121 South St. Louis Avenue, and up at the top of the certificate, it says Chicago specifically, but he's also residing at that address, that same address, which then implies he died at home. If I take a look at his occupation, it says switchman, which is correct, but not totally correct, because if you look at the certificate, his last occupation is a laborer for the city of Chicago from 1903 to his death in 1913. And he was previously a switchman, spelled incorrectly, for a steam railroad from 1861 to 1903 for 40 years. But only the switchman occupation actually shows up on the index. Taking a look at his parents' names, John McDonough and Mary Ashurn, as it looks here, we take a look at the certificate, and yes, it is John McDonough, but it is added that he's born in Ireland, and his mother is Mary. And once you look at other records, you know that this is Asburne, so it's Osborne, born in New York. Now, I can understand how the OS, and that could be an HI, and they would have had difficulty with that, and I understand that. But not only are the names there, which they are here, but it also gives birthplaces, which are very important things to know off of an actual certificate. And finally, we have the informant's name, J.T. McDonough. And if I look at that, it is J.T. McDonough. There is no relationship there, though usually that is indicated, but at least we have an address for him. Excuse me, I pushed the wrong key. There is an address in Chicago because this is 1913, perhaps he's living at that address in 1910, and it would give me at least a place to start for 1910, and also for the city directories to use as a starting point. Now, to show you one from another country, this is from Scotland, and the basics are here. This is a christening record, not a death, but a christening. So we have the christening date and the place and so on. But if you take a close look at this, take a look at the christening date and the birth date. Now, in this case, it may make sense about a year apart between birth and christening. But sometimes when you take a look at this, it has christened in 1828 and born in 1829. And that is a result of taking the old indexes that the church had produced on microfiche and uploading that data into the computer and into FamilySearch. And in some instances, those dates got switched. And so there's nothing they can do about it. It's just a quirk of the system. But another reason why it's always a good idea to take a look at the actual certificate. And if I take a look at the church entry, we see that this is 1829, and we have born the 23rd of December. So if you take a look at this, it has the 28th of January. And I'm not sure where that would have come from. Some way or another, whoever indexed it figured out that date, but that isn't the correct date. He was born the 23rd of December and baptized on the 8th of January. If you go back and look at this, that is correct. But if he's born in December, and this is January of 29, that means his birth year is 28, which they did finally figure it out. Also, in addition to the dates, this particular church entry tells us that he's a lawful son of John Henry and Teresa McIntosh, meaning that his parents were married under the church laws of Scotland at the time, that the family is living at Briggs within this parish, and there are also witnesses down here that you should pay attention to as well. So while the index has some of the basic information, I'm going to go back a minute. It has the dates, it has the parish name and the parents, and it also says it's it has the parent that it's a male and the mother and father are male and female. But when you take a look at the actual certificate, there is a lot more information there in this church entry. And this is quite common when you're going from an index to an actual entry, whether it is vital records of a government or of a church. Giving you another thing to look at, and second on my handout, if you have a copy of that, is to note the registration dates. So here we have a death certificate for a Margaret, or a birth certificate rather, for Margaret Minnie Borgwald, born in Chicago, and there's her birth date, April 17th, 1893. But if you look at the very bottom of the certificate, you see that it's filed in 1941, 48 years after her birth. And the person who filed it is her father, Fred Borgwald, living at 1646 North Artesian. The birth supposedly took place at 19 Berlin, which is also where the parents are living. Now, not to say that this is incorrect, but with a 48-year gap between the event that's being recorded and the event date that's being filed, you would need to take the time to actually see if you can find a baptismal record or something else of that sort that would then prove that this is the correct birth date. And you may also have to start from addresses looking for a church that's nearby or so forth. In the 1940s, you're going to find a lot of people that have what is called a delayed birth certificate because they were born in a time when either their state or city did not keep records, or they were not required, or people just didn't know they were required. And so there were a lot of people at the end of the 19th century, early part of the 20th, who do not have birth certificates until the 1940s when they are very much adults. So make sure you note not just the birth date up here, but when was that filed? That's very important. All right, let's take a look at church records now. And I'm starting with the wiki, the FamilySearch Research Wiki, because when you're starting church records, there's a lot of background information on the wiki about various church denominations, about the types of records they kept, and I'm just going to show you a few examples to give you an idea of what you can find. If you've never used the Research Wiki on FamilySearch, it's a genealogical guide created and maintained by FamilySearch. It contains over 100,000 articles with links to databases, websites. It has resources, research strategies, guidance, and so on. And the wiki adds about 100 new articles daily. So it is your vast resource of getting direction and background on a particular geographic area or religion to help you find church records and, for that matter, vital records. So when you're on the home page for FamilySearch, you go up to the search function right up here at the top. And when that opens up, you are choosing the last option under search, Research Wiki. When that opens, this screen comes up with a map. And what you now need to do is you go up to the little search window. Now, in your handout on the last page, I gave you this image as part of your handout so that you can make notes at this point if you wanted to. So in this little search box, you can enter the name of a place, you can enter a name of a religion or an occupation, or perhaps even a trail, an immigration trail, or something like that. But we're going to type in Sweden, because I wanted to show you what you can get for languages other than English, or English, if that is something that you have problems doing translations for. But I'm going to do Sweden, and it comes up, this is the top of it. Now it keeps going. It's quite a long screen of information about Sweden, but I wanted you to see right at the very beginning here, there is this set of tools which are related to and will help you with Sweden genealogy research. And you can go through here and you can click them on, and you'll notice here there's a Swedish word list and there's a Latin word list, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. But there's also parish register headings. When you take a look at the parish registers of Sweden, obviously they're in Swedish, and that includes the column headings. So in the wiki, there is this page. This is a birth and christening record, but here's what the church register will have for their column headings. And then this is the English translation of those columns. And once you know that the child's name is in this column, and the birth date is here, and the christening date is here, and the parents' names are here, then you really don't have to worry too much about reading the rest of the page. The main things you need to know, you now know where they're located. And then as long as you can read the alphabet, you can pretty much decipher the information you need. And they have this kind of a list for over 80 languages. Some helps with writing letters and reading church registers and so on. Now, here's the church. This is a marriage entry from the city of Chicago, St. Stanislaus Kostka Catholic Church, which was a Polish congregation, one of the largest Polish congregations outside of Poland at one point. And usually the priests either wrote in Latin, but most of the time they wrote in Polish. And so you can, if you take a look at this, sorry about that, you can see, I can spot a couple of words, like here's George, but most of this is, I think that's Joseph and Josepha, but what does this word mean, and what is this over here, and so on. In order to translate this, you can do it very easily with a Polish dictionary. Now, if you don't have a Polish dictionary, FamilySearch also has genealogical word lists, little mini dictionaries online for over 80 languages. And it's still in the wiki. It is part of the wiki. But now in my search box, I'm going to type the name of the language and the word word. So Polish word, and I come to Polish word list. And here's the outline of everything that's included in this wiki article. So there's a discussion of the alphabetical order of Polish, which is quite different than ours. It's somewhat similar, but they have several special characters that they use that are at the end of their alphabet. We have Polish grammar rules. We have keywords, and I'll show you that in a minute, how the numbers are written in Polish, how the dates, months, days, and so on are written. And then there is a general little dictionary from A to Z of the most common Polish words that you're going to be seeing in the records that you're reading. So here's the keywords, and here's the English word that we normally would be looking for within a document. And over here are the Polish words for that English word. So if you take a look under marriage, we have 3 different versions of that in the Polish records. We have 4 different words for Protestant. This is evangelical. This is Reformed Protestant. There's Protestant, and this is Lutheran. So it could be any one of those 4. We've got burial variants on that, and so on. These are the key words that we would normally look for. There's a similar chart for the numbers and dates and days of the week and so on. And then at the end is this little dictionary, A to Z. All of this is in PDF format, so you can download it and save it. You can print it for your own desk for a reference if you wish. But over here would be the Polish word that you might wonder what it means. And then over here is the English translation. So for instance, if you were to find this word as the occupation of the father, you would see that he's a dispensing chemist or a pharmacist. Here's the word for midwife, and so on. Very, very helpful. And I've used these word lists several times in both Sweden and Poland and Norway, and it has been very successful for me getting out the key points of an entry. I'm not going to be able to translate every single word, but I get enough out of it that I get what I need. Another thing to do when you're working in church records especially is to note the witnesses and sponsors. This is a key analysis you need to make, especially when you are just beginning on a family or you're stuck, you've hit a brick wall, and you really don't know who the other members of the family are that you should be looking for. So here, I'm going to show you an example from my own research. So the Brady McDonough families, my grandparents, George Brady and Margaret McDonough, as I go back in time to the earliest entry, which is August of 1843, which is Andrew's baptism in Chicago, and then work my way up to the point in time where they passed away and around 1913. I went through, did the month and year, and then I indicated who the sponsor was for the baptism or the witness was for the marriage. And I went through every single marriage and baptism, which was all I could get out of the church. If there was a burial with burial witnesses, I would also include that. But in the Chicago records, we don't get that. So after I've done this, I went back and now my analysis starts. I first start to look for the surname, my surnames that I am familiar with that are associated with the Brady McDonough families, and I color code them. So the McDonoughs in this case are green, or anyone I know that's associated with the McDonoughs. Or the other side is Jones. Andrew married a Jones, so I now have a color for Jones. And as I go through, you can see how I did this. So there's Jones again, there's more green. And then when we start to get Brady's in the records, then I gave them their own color. And then this Harv Nelson is also a different color because there were several Nelson marriages in the family, but I don't know if this is one of them or if he relates to one of those spouses. But I do want to make note that that is a name of interest. So I gave that its own color. And I worked through. And then if you take a look at this, and I'm going to go back one, you can see that for every single baptism or marriage, at least one of the witnesses or sponsors was a member of the family. And in some cases, both of them were up there and down here, and also this one. So when you come to another one where neither one of them are a known member of the family, and you can't identify any link to Thomas Madden or Mary Fitzgerald, then you have some names for future research. These may be of importance within the context of the larger family, and especially because Thomas Madden was a marriage witness in 96 and a baptismal sponsor in 98. Why does that name pop up twice? There is some significance to that name. I still haven't figured out why. He's very difficult to determine which Thomas Madden it is. There's a lot of them in Chicago, but that is at least highlighting a potential area of research for me to maybe find some clue for a brick wall or for who married someone that I wasn't sure what happened with that daughter and so forth. So taking these witnesses and sponsors, color coding, or however else you want to designate the different families, and looking for the patterns, and for people who don't fit, in quotes, will give you some definite research possibilities. For instance, if I also go back to the one before, we have Teresa McDonough, and then we have Tessie McDonough, and we have a Carney in there. Well, Teresa, there's a Teresa Carney who's named after Teresa McDonough, and you can find out those sorts of relationships also. So witnesses and sponsors, and that takes us through the vital records and the church records. And now I want to move on to the census. This is an area particularly where people do not take the time to analyze what that census is telling you. And sometimes, too frequently, I'll get a patron who only uses the index and never actually opens up to the complete enumeration page to get the full data on the family. It's important keep in mind when you're talking about the US Census that from 1790 to 1840, it is only listing the head of the household, not necessarily a father. It could be a grandfather. It could be an uncle. It is just whoever was considered to be the head of the household. The members of the household are represented by numerical counts, how many females, how many males, and in various age groups. Then in 1850, it's the first time the U.S. federal census endeavored to list every person in the household by name. not in the family necessarily, because there are no relationships listed in 1850. All we know for certain is that these are people who lived in the same household in that year. They could all be related. They might not be all related. There might be some employees in there, or some servants, or lodgers, or boarders. So don't make any assumptions about 1850 regarding relationship. 1880 was the first census to indicate relationships, father, mother, child, and so forth, and the marital status. Before 1880, you didn't even know if they were married or single. And also, in addition to their own birthplace, it now lists their parents' birthplaces. And because this is 1880 and previous to that 1870, very early on in German history in terms of it being its own country, you'll often see references in those two censuses and 1860 as well as to a particular duchy or principality in Germany that later on all of the censuses are only going to give you Germany. So if you have family that reaches back to 60, 70, or 80, be sure you check those because you might find a better indication other than Germany from their birthplaces. 1890 was destroyed after a 1921 fire in the U.S. Commerce Building. You'll often read that it was destroyed in the fire. It was not, but it was so water-soaked that Congress decided to destroy that census, and there's only a few pages that actually still exist for the whole country. 1900, they indicated for the first time the year of immigration. Take that with the largest grain of salt that you can find. It is often wrong by at least a few years and sometimes way off. And so it's a clue, but if you can't find it under that year, don't think that there's something wrong. It could very well be that the census taker heard wrong, or the family literally did not remember the exact year they immigrated to the United States because it was 20 or 30 years ago. That census also will tell you if the home was owned or rented. And if the home is owned, that directs you to property records in that particular locality that you should start going to look for. And finally, in 1940 and 1950, up through 1930, all of the questions of the census were asked about every person in the census, everyone in the household. But that was getting to be too big a list of questions, and especially in 1940. So they decided to ask it only of a small sample of the population, usually only 2 or 3 people on the page in 1940, and 5% of the population in 1950 were asked the supplemental questions. And if you happen to have someone in your family that falls into that small sample, you're going to find out a lot of additional information about only that person, but a great deal about their employment and so forth. 40, of course, is at the very end of the Depression, and 50 is after World War II, when there was so much movement across the country of people moving to the suburbs or to different states for new jobs and so on. So here's an example of how you can read what you need to read. This is 1900 census, my grandparents. Here's the street address. Always look over here, if you're in a city or urban area, suburban area, look for the street and the house number, because that could direct you to both leases and property taxes and land records and so forth. Churches. It might help you find a church that would be close to where they lived. Here's the household number here. And then we have George H. Brady, his wife Maggie, and his son George A. He's the head, she's the wife, she's the son. He's white. And that is supposed to be an M, but it got kind of scribbled. But she's white female, white male. Month and year of birth, and this is the only census of the United States that gives the actual birth date in terms of month and year. But again, take this with a grain of salt, because it may be correct, but it also might not be correct. And I would say in my own experience, at least 30 to 40% of the time, they are not totally accurate. Maybe the year is right, but the month is off, or vice versa. Then their age, And then M for married. There's an S for single up here, so you can see that. And they've been married 4 years at the date of the census in 1900. And for the women who were married, or not the single women, not the divorced women, and not the widowed women, only the married women, for the most part, it asked, how many children have you had? That's the first column. And how many are still living? So by the 1900 census, in that 4 years of marriage, Maggie has had 2 children and one is already deceased. We continue across the page, and we see that all 3 of them were born in Illinois, but George's father was born in Wisconsin, and both of their mothers were born in Ireland. So we now need to start thinking about, how do I trace that kind of immigration pattern? And George is an engineer for a railroad. And these are some literacy questions here. And finally, it rents his home. Now, if you look down here, we have an O for owned, M is mortgaged, and he has his home. This could also be an F, which would be free of mortgage. But in this case, he's renting his home. So would be the complete thing. So we get an occupation, a complete occupation. We find out he rents. We find out how many years they've been married. We find out they've lost a baby already in the first 4 years. And so if you take the time to really look through this, you can learn quite a bit about the family. And then if you go through all of the censuses, which I suggest you don't miss any census that a person may be alive for or that an older sibling is alive for. Put together all of them and do a time frame, a timeline, and glean all of those little facts out of all of them and put together the whole picture of the family. Now I'm showing you another death certificate. This is from my grandmother, Margaret Ellen Brady, and it identifies her father as Andrew McDonough, and her mother is Ellen, surname unknown. Well, if I take a look at that same census page, here's George, Maggie, and George. The family immediately after them is Andrew McDonough and his wife, Ellen, and their son, William. They're living in the same building because there's the house number, and that means it's both, but they're in 2 different households, 2 different flats, as we would say in Chicago, or apartments. So is this Andrew and Ellen Maggie's parents? Don't make the assumption that because the names match, it is, but it is worth following up on to use that as your clues. So we have Andrew and Ellen, their birth dates. They've been married 33 years. And if you go on further, they were both born in Illinois, of Illinois fathers, and his mother is New York and her mother is Ireland. Actually, she's born in Ireland. So we've got a possible linkage here between Andrew and Maggie. And one of the reasons I'm showing you this is always take a look at who else is on the page, especially in small towns, rural areas. It very well may be another relative. And even if you aren't sure of those names now, or they're not familiar to you now, the first time you look at the page, make a note of those surnames at least. So if something pops later on, you can go, oh, wait a minute, didn't I see that on the same page as my grandparents in 1900? So you can use that as your clues and to keep that in mind when you're doing further research. This is in your handout. I've outlined this entire list in your handout so that you don't have to take time to write it down right now, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see the different questions that have been asked over time. They have changed very much between 1850 and 1950 in that 100-year period. Some of them are related to economics and some of them are related to demographics. And one of them, for instance, did the household have a radio in 1930? Why would that have been an important question in 1930? Well, radios were still relatively new. They had just done the first coast-to-coast radio broadcast around 1923, just only 7 years earlier. So the government, the United States government, wanted to determine if there were enough radios out amongst the population that the government could start using the radio as a means of communication to get the word out, so to speak, across the country. And 4 years later, we have the first fireside chat with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and that is partially a result of this particular question in the 1930 census. So we could take a look, and as I said, this entire list is in your handout. Now let's look at another country. Again, we're going back to Scotland. And here's the family I was interested in. James Kellis, his wife Mary, his daughter Margaret. This is household number 34. They're living in the farmstead called Crofthead. And he's a grocer, a clothier, and dealer in butter and eggs. So he has a couple of different hats to earn enough money to support his family. He's born in Aberdeenshire, and the ditto goes all the way up to Cabrick. So he is born in this parish. You see up here it's Cabrick. His wife, however, is born in Elva, and then their daughter Margaret, she is also born in Cabrick. So you at least get an age, you get an occupation for him, so it gives you an idea of economic status for the family. You know where they lived, and you might be able to find that on a map. And you get an idea of where to look for a birth record for them, or a baptismal record in this case. This is 1851, before they started civil records. But the other thing to do, remember I said, always look to see at the other families and at least keep track of the surnames. So we have a Henry family, Smith, McConaughey, and McCombie, also living in very close proximity to the James Kellis families. These two are at Nether Ardwell, and he's also living in Crofthead. And if you've done enough work in an area and you get an idea, and this is where history and geography comes into it, know your history, know your geography, take time to learn that about the area your family is living in and comes from. You would know that these little places, Crofthead and Nether Ardwell, are just a cluster of maybe 4 or 5 buildings. So if James McCombie lives also in Crofthead, and if Alexander Henry and John Smith also live in Nether Ardwell, there's a strong possibility that they're related. And in fact, every single one of these surnames on this page relate to James Kellis and his wife Mary. Most of them are brothers and sisters, but they could also be children. Every single family on this page is related. So you want to take time to look at that. It doesn't prove anything just by the census, but it gives you a ton of clues to follow up on. Always look at every enumeration for which a person was alive, and including an earlier census if they are older siblings, and create your timeline. So here's my dad, William James Brady. He was born in July of 1901. So in the 1910 census, he's age 8, living with his parents in 1901 South Hamlin in Chicago. 1920, his age is consistent. He's now, because he's an adult, a dry goods store clerk, but the family has moved from Chicago to Downers Grove. Not only is that a different city, it's a different county. This is Cook County, this is DuPage County. In 1930, he's age 29, consistent, and he's now married to Margaret. Her surname is unknown. And he's a fireman at a stone quarry living in LaGrange. So we've gone from Chicago to Downers Grove to LaGrange. And his father, remember, was a railroad engineer for a railroad. And if you take a look, there is a railroad that connects all 3 towns, and it's the old Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, which is in fact what his father worked for. The other thing, when you see these occupations, don't make assumptions based on modern day. The word fireman today means a firefighter, but in the time frame that he was working in 1930, it meant that he was a stoker for a boiler of a steam shovel in the stone quarry. Now, you might have to do a little bit of digging to get definitions of older terms or older definitions of terms, but that's what he did. He was actually feeding the fire of a steam shovel in a stone quarry. He shoveled wood or coal or something similar. In 1940, he's 38, still married to a Margaret, And now he's a stationary engineer, which is basically meaning he was doing the same thing, only instead of working in the stone quarry, now he's working in a department store. And then in 1950, he's now married to a Gertrude, which implies at least a second marriage. This doesn't necessarily mean this is the same Margaret either. These could be two different Margarets. I have one person in my house, in my family records, that he married 3 Marjories in a row. He must have liked the name. But here we have my dad married to Gertrude. He's a construction inspector for the city of Chicago. So it's an outdoor work again. And then there's where they're living. So you can see there's a little bit of things to be gleaned. We have wives' names, possibly 3, at least 2. We see that he lived in Chicago most of the time, but at some point in time, he was also in a different county, a different town. So you would analyze all of this, and it gives you clues and ideas for further research. Now, I'm throwing this in here. It really isn't the analysis per se, but I do want you to be aware of using social networking to help you find clues and to follow up on what you're finding, especially in the census or even the church and civil records. In Facebook, there is a Facebook page called The Living History of Illinois and Chicago. It is a vetted page, so it's safe to use, and it is actually part of the curriculum for the state of Illinois. And back in October, one of the posts on this Facebook page showed this photo album. And it has the making of the Edens Highway 1950 to 56. And the Edens Highway was the first expressway, if you will, in the Chicago area, the first multi-lane divided limited access highway that we had in the Chicago area. And this one gentleman who was part of the general contractor for the job for the county record, for the county of Cook, he created this photo album of the building of the Edens Highway. And it's some 75 pages inserted into this photo album. And he nicely identified the photos, including the names, if he knew them. So there's lots of pictures of bulldozers and trucks and things like that. But my father, on that construction that he was referencing in the 1950 census, and this is the same year, one of his first jobs when he was working for the county and the city was working on the Edens Highway. So I took a chance and went through it page by page. And on page, I believe this is 34, I find this photo of the county engineers and Mr. Bush of Arcola Construction talking over at the Harrison Street Bridge. So here they are. I don't know what they're talking about, but they're talking about something. And this is my father. And this is his best friend. This is the way I remember my father, with that hat, with this jacket, with his pocket stuffed with cigars and his sheet protector and his pocket protector and his pencils and all of that. Never wore a tie. This is how I remember my dad. And this is dated, you can see here, June 30th, 1951, roughly a year after that census enumeration where it said he was a construction supervisor. Here's a picture of him actually at work. Now, this was possibly a fluke, but because I do keep up on some of these other Facebook and social networking sites that have something to do with either the genealogy of an area or the history of an area, I pick up clues like this all the time, and I wanted just to share one big, huge success. Now, FamilySearch has FamilySearch communities. You go to the wiki, and for your search term, just put in FamilySearch community, and be sure you make it one word for FamilySearch. And these are all vetted and sponsored by FamilySearch. They're all Facebook groups here. And you can see how they've divided, but for the United States, they're in regional areas. So we have the southern states, the western states, and so on. But these communities are places where you can post your queries, you can ask for help on a research problem, and the whole community, well, not the whole community, but you're likely to get 20, 30, 40, 50 responses trying to help you with whatever your problem is or your conundrum. I had one that I put in to the Midwest one, trying to find some proof of my great-grandmother's death in Missouri in 1896. And 75 minutes after I put up my query, an hour and 15 minutes later, I had an obituary of her death from the local newspaper down there in Missouri that somebody knew where they were and how to source it, and he went and found the obit for me. So these family search communities can be very, very helpful in helping you figure out how to solve a problem, or where to go next when I have this clue. Now, what do I do with it, and so on. So now let's take a look at home sources. And by that, I mean handwritten documents you find in your home, letters, postcards, diaries, whatever you may find in drawers or trunks or boxes or wherever you find these things in your home or your sister's home or your aunt's home or your uncle's or whatever. So one of the major problems with handwritten is reading the handwriting. We typically are not the best of people, any of us, with writing handwriting, unless you happen to be one of the careful ones. And especially when you're dealing with foreign languages, not only do you have to deal with the language, but you got to deal with different letters. So in, again, the wiki, you could remember we had the one that was Polish and Word. Well, I want help with handwriting in Danish records. So I put the country and then the word handwriting. And now I come up with the wiki article called Denmark Handwriting. And there's all kinds of sources on here to help you learn how to read the Danish handwriting so you can determine the letters, so you can then go to the Danish word list to figure out what the words are. So here's some examples. This is a chart of the Gothic alphabet from around 1600. I think that's misspelled, but you can see all the ways the A and the B. This is a special letter in Danish. Here's how you get to the F's. These are F's, not S's, because down here we have the S's. You can see the difference. And here's the special Danish letters with the umlauts and so on. And you can print this and have it sitting next to you on your desk or table, and that can help you letter by letter decipher perhaps what the word is you're looking at. And then also FamilySearch through the wiki has a vast library of video lessons that you can look at as at your leisure, stop, start, and so forth. Many of them have handouts. This is one of them that comes up for Denmark on reading the old Scandinavian script, and it takes you through it and gives you examples and gives you time to practice and so on. And you can see here's an actual syllabus down here. When you're doing English handwriting, which is not supposedly a foreign language, but sometimes somebody's handwriting makes it look like a foreign language, some ideas to work with that. You look for the similar shape in another word on the page that you can decipher. So perhaps he writes Mary in a funny way and you can't quite read it, but further down the page he was more careful and you can tell, well, that's the word Mary. And now compare it to the word up above and, oh, by golly, yes, that's Mary, or that is an M, or that's an H, or it's a K, or whatever. So always look for similar shapes in around the rest of the page, not just in names, but in occupations and places and so forth. All of the words on the page, try to find something similar. If you're deciphering a name, does the name make sense within the context of the culture you are working with? So if you're working in the South, they use very different name formats down South, which makes sense to a Southerner, but maybe not to a Northerner. Or they're using nicknames, and it's a strange kind of a nickname. So if it doesn't quite make sense to you, still copy it the way it reads, but think about trying to figure out, is this something I need to research a little bit more to see if there's other forms of the name? Is this a nickname that might be used for a more common name that I would think of as a more common name? For instance, in Tennessee, I have found a lot of girls named Dicey, D-I-C-E-Y, and most of the time that stands for Diana. So by looking up the name and trying to get the background of the name. And I just realized I forgot to give you a website in your handout. It is called Beyond the Name, as one word, beyondthename.com. Or sorry, Behind the Name. I always do that. Behindthename.com. And it's only looking at given names, not surnames, but it identifies all the different forms of that name in a variety of languages. It gives you nicknames for that name, the history of the name, what it may meant in its original language, and so forth. It has been very, very helpful to me. Behindthename.com. Then occupational names may be strange to us, but record them as they appear, because at the time frame of the record, they were not strange terms. So I'm going to show you one. This is in the 1891 census in Aberdeen, Scotland, and it was an older lady in her 70s, and her occupation was what you see in red. It's pronounced in Scottish Doric, from the part of Scotland my family is from, potted heed maker. All of us in my family know exactly what that means. Most people in that part of Scotland know exactly what that means. But for us in the United States, it's head cheese. She makes head cheese and sells head cheese probably at a stand or something like that. But that's totally strange to us in the modern United States. Write it down anyway, do some research on it. Google helps a lot with this so that you get some sense as to what she actually did for a living. And then finally, remember, spelling does not count. Records were oral. They never asked, or hardly ever asked, people how they spelled something. They wrote down what they heard. And in fact, sometimes I think people themselves just wrote down what they felt like. I found one record in a church that on one page, a particular gentleman had written in his own handwriting his name 3 times, and each of the 3 times he spelled his name a different way. So spelling does not count until around the First World War, when governments really got into the record-keeping business and they wanted things to be spelled right, in quotes. So if you find something that sounds right, it probably is or could be what you're looking for. Now, a little bit of practice. This is a letter written from my great-great-grandfather to one of his brothers. He was living in Scotland. His brother was in Nova Scotia, and he wrote this letter in 1855, May 11th. It's 4 pages long. This is just the first page, and I'm going to blow up part of it. And if you take a look at this, when I do this live, I give you a chance to actually go through it and see what you can glean from this. But up here we have, he has 4 sons. His first daughter had 4 sons, and the oldest is living in Gold Diggins, which I'm thinking is the word diggings and is a reference to the gold fields of Australia. Her second is in America, doesn't tell if it's the United States or Canada. We might make the assumption it's the United States, but I wouldn't do that. Her third is in England. The fourth is a schoolmaster. And it goes through and he outlines all of his siblings and his children in this letter. So we end up, from this letter, taking the time to read it carefully and maybe deciphering some letters, looking around the page. Teresa is married to John Henry, a mason in Fogelone, and they had 4 children. Now, also, this is a letter from home, from one brother to another, and the brother in Nova Scotia grew up in Scotland. He's familiar with the nicknames for the towns in the area, so he knows what Fogelone is. For the rest of us, it's the name Abercurter. So again, Google is what solved that problem for me. I don't know what Fogelone is, looked it up in Google and found it. Lily is married to Alexander Taylor. There's the son in Gold Diggins and so on. The daughter Jean, or the sister Jean, is deceased. She's married to a Wright, also in Fogelone, doesn't identify him, but he's a Wright. There aren't going to be too many Wrights in one little town in that time frame. She's had 3 children, but only one is living. and that's going to be the heir to the few. And the few is a medieval term which was still used in Scotland, referencing lease. His children, the oldest daughter was married to a miller at Garysford. Jean is married to a gardener at Dalgety. Bella's home, John is in Elva, and so on. I wish he had named the sons-in-law, but he didn't. But this is actually my great-grandmother and her husband. And so one of the neat things about this letter is it proved all my research was right. It was quite a nice day to get that. Now, moving on to obituaries and newspaper articles very quickly. Hatch, match, and dispatch is what we usually think of as what we're looking for. Marriage announcements, birth announcements, burials, and so on. And these were quickly, I was going to go through these, but to give you an idea of what else can be in there, this is a marriage story, an announcement of a marriage, but included in this article, the deceased of Mr. Guffey prevented the young couple from having a church wedding. So we have the date of the wedding up here, and we now know that Mr. Guffey, who was her stepfather, he died very recently before that. And so it gives you an idea of when to go looking for some proof of death. Here's another one. Whoops. This is my great-grandmother's obituary that gentleman found for me in 75 minutes. And I get a full outline of all of the important details, not proven. This is part of the analysis. This gives you your hints of what to go look for. So I've now proven the death, and I now have also proven her marriage in separate records, but I still have yet to find any proof that that is her birth date. But you can see it comes from the Iron County Register. But there's always more to what's in the newspaper than hatch, match, and dispatch. Here's an actual obituary, if you will, from the era in London, England in 1842, and it talks about this 102-year-old gentleman who passed away. But down here in the middle of it is a little story about this gentleman was of an age that he actually remembered the Duke of Cumberland's army marching through their parish in 1745 on their way to the Battle of Culloden, where the English army met the army of Bonnie Prince Charlie. It's a major event in Scottish history. And here is William, who was about 5 or 6 at the time, who remembers what went on when his father spotted the army coming and how he was given the job of taking care of the chickens and so on. A lovely little bit of personal information about him that you typically are not going to find any other way, especially when you're talking about somebody who died in 1842. And here's another thing you should be on the lookout at home, especially. My dad, during the war, worked for a radio company, Belmont Radio. They made tank radios, and at one point, he was also very active in the Union, and he became president of the Union. And when that happened, the newspaper for the company, they had a little newspaper they put out, did this entire little spotlight on my dad. And as you go through it, you find out all kinds of little details about his occupational history. Here's the hoisting engineers, which would be the stationary engineer that he was, that his father was part of the Brotherhood of Railroad Engineers. Here's his birth date, his military service, that he was part of the American Legion, where he lives. Here's a description of marrying my mother, and that's that second wife, Gertrude. And then also my own birth in March 15, 1945. But then his second venture, here's what the indication that Margaret is the same Margaret in both censuses with his 2 children and so forth. So we get a full background of my dad in this and a lot of information, a lot of clues to go for. When you're looking for the 5 newspaper sites, this is in your handout. And Chronicling America is particularly good for rural newspapers, and the rest of them are various parts of the United States and international. Newspapers.com is heavy into Canada, and it also has some British Isles material. There is a British newspaper archive website as well, and there are others. There's one for New Zealand, there's one for Australia. Different countries have these websites. For U.S. obituaries, particularly circa 1980 current, it's Heritage Hub, which is only at public libraries or libraries. So I often get the question, which newspaper site is best? And giving you an example, when I look up my great-great-grandfather, Michael Brady, who lived in Kenosha, Wisconsin, 1843 to 44, I had 185 hits at Chronicling America, none at Newspaper Archives, and 11 in newspapers. They all cover different newspapers, so you cannot use just one site. You literally have to check all of them. And that usually means between family search centers and libraries, public libraries, you can find a way to access all of them. Finding other newspapers, this is the Chronicling America site. And right now I'm talking only about US newspaper sources. But up here this is their homepage. And up here in the corner, there is a directory of every newspaper ever published in the United States. And you go in and you search by the state or the county or the city. And so I did Gallatin, Tennessee, and here's the list of the 28 newspapers that were published there, the name and the years and the actual the town it was actually published in. Well, I looked up Gallatin, so everything is Gallatin. But if you looked at the state, it would give you the states around. So that gives you a way to determine, for the period of time you're trying to find information, what newspaper was actually published. And then if you click on the name of the newspaper, it will tell you whether it's online or not. And if it's not online, what archive holds it. So an excellent way to get to newspaper researches. Sometimes on wiki, if you go in and you type in the name of the state, in this case, and the word newspapers as you search, you will get a list of all of the newspapers associated with that state and the databases that have been developed to search those various newspapers. And you can see this is from Genealogy Bank, this is MyHeritage, this comes from Ancestor Hut, and so forth. Some of these are on government sites at the University of Wisconsin, and some of them are on paid sites, but you'll get a list of all of them with links to them. And then there's the Periodical Source Index, sometimes called PERSI, usually referred to as PERSI. You can see right here. And while this isn't usually newspapers, it is periodicals, and it covers the world. You can see we've got Canada, British Isles, United States, but other countries are also covered in here. And you can search by geographical or by surname. And here's, I tried to look up something in Marquette County, Michigan. And you can see the topics are over here. There's 399 articles. You notice it's articles about history of Marquette. There's 25 about school records. There's 12 military records articles and so on. And you pick one of those subjects, and then you get a list of every article. Here's the title, who published it, the society or whatever that published it. This one's the State Board of Education. It tells you the year it was published. And with this information, at the bottom of the page, there's a request form, and you can request from the Allen County Public Library, where all of these are held. They will copy that article for you. And there's a fee, the fee is going to be different depending on how long the article is, but they will copy it and send you the photocopy, or actually now a digital copy of that article for your own use. So for instance, here's Ishpeming settlers. Here's Green Garden in Chocolate Township. It was German and so on. Tons and tons and tons of information in PERSI, and I wanted to be sure you were aware of it. Remember to always prove relationships, make no assumptions. Even if the census taker says it's a son or daughter, prove it. Often a son or daughter could be a grandson, granddaughter, niece, nephew, even cousin, or just plain friend. So here's an example from 1900 census, and this is really quick. This is my Henry Brady with his second wife and his stepchildren. And when I first found this, I didn't think it was my Henry because it wasn't the right wife and children. So prove things. If everything about him matches, which it did, then why is it a different wife and children? Your clues are there. You just have to follow up. And I'm going to skip past these in the interest of time. online researches, always check your databases. So the newspapers, there are 3 different, you can see the different ways to search, and they're all different. They all have different things they include in their indexes, and you have to work with either the elaborate one or the very narrow one and learn to do that. In the census, be sure you notice also in both Ancestry and FamilySearch what you can search by, and you don't always have to have a name. So I did a search without the name of someone born in Illinois between 1870 and 1880. Their birthplace is Illinois. Their father's birthplace is Wisconsin. That's my great-grandfather. And the mother's birthplace is Ireland. That's my great-grandmother. Now, these 3 together are not that usual. They're not that common. And when I did that, I found the one sister on her second marriage, her second husband, and I would never have been able to figure that out if I hadn't done that kind of a search. Because if I had looked for Laura Nelson, I wouldn't have found her. So you can also, on FamilySearch and Ancestry, take a look to see if you can search by parents' names only in a database of births. And when I did that for William Hunter and Catherine Taylor, I get a complete list of all 6 of their children in one search without having to guess. It all comes up together. So good luck in your search. And I know we really didn't leave time for questions. I apologize for that. But thank you very much, Olivia.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on February 15th with Larry Jensen. He will be giving a presentation entitled Using German Maps Analysis. This will be a pre-recorded lecture with no Q&A section. However, Larry Jensen's contact information will be provided at the end of the webinar. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.